Mike Epps, and everything just started to come into play, and we just started like wow, this is going to be a really great film. You got the music, Curtis Mayfield.
Known as The Voice and one of the most awarded female artists of all time, Whitney Houston captivated the world with her unmatched talent and unforgettable hits. But behind the platinum records and standing ovations was a woman battling pain few ever saw. In this video, we take you behind the faded glamour of Whitney Houston's life, from the abandoned mansion that once echoed with music and laughter, to the love story that turned turbulent, and the daughter she cherished above all else. We'll explore her rise to stardom, the relationships that shaped her, the tragedy that shocked the world, and the net worth she left behind. This is more than just a story of fame. It's a haunting look at legacy, loss, and the cost of brilliance, childhood, and early ambitions. Long before the world knew her name, she was just Nippy. Born on August 9th, 1963, in Newark, New Jersey, Whitney Elizabeth Houston entered a world already steeped in music. Her nickname, Nippy, came from her father, John Houston, inspired by a mischievous cartoon character, fitting for a spirited girl full of energy and wonder. But even then, there was something different about her, something divine. The youngest of 3 children, Whitney was raised in a tight-knit, deeply religious household where music was more than entertainment, it was worship. Her mother, the legendary gospel singer Whitney Houston, had sung backup for icons like Elvis Presley and Aretha Franklin. Her cousin, Dionne Warwick, and her godmother, the Queen of Soul herself, Aretha Franklin. This wasn't just talent, it was lineage. It was at New Hope Baptist Church that Whitney first opened her mouth to sing, and the room fell still. At just 11 years old, her voice carried the kind of purity and emotional depth most singers spend decades chasing. Congregants would say it sounded like a gift straight from God, and in many ways, it was. By the time she was a teenager, Whitney was already standing in for her mother on stage, backing her up at nightclubs and recording gospel harmonies in studios around town. Her voice was an echo of her mother's, but even richer, smoother, more ethereal. Still, her family was careful. They knew the music industry could be as ruthless as it was glamorous. Sissy made Whitney promise, church first, discipline always, no shortcuts. But Whitney wasn't just destined for music. She was stunning, with radiant skin, expressive eyes, and a natural poise that caught the attention of modeling agencies. At just 18, she became one of the first African-American women to grace the cover of 17 magazine, breaking racial barriers and redefining beauty standards for a generation of young black girls. Yet even as the cameras flashed, Whitney never let the lights blind her. Deep down, she knew her voice would be her calling card. The road was opening, but not without potholes. Growing up in the 1960s and 70s in Newark wasn't always easy. The city bore scars from the civil unrest of the late 60s. And though her family later moved to East Orange, New Jersey, Whitney would carry the memory of struggle, of black identity, of faith tested within her music. Her voice wasn't just sound, it was soul. It told stories of longing, resilience, love, and survival. As a child, she dreamed big, but she never imagined how big. That the voice she honed in the church pews would one day shake arenas. That the songs she sang with her mother in quiet rehearsal would one day top global charts. That she would become the most awarded female artist of all time. But in these early years, she was still just Whitney, a daughter, a church girl, a dreamer with God in her heart and a universe in her lungs. And the world was about to hear her. Initial career breakthrough. In the early 1980s, inside the crowded, buzzing clubs of Manhattan, a quiet storm was building. Whitney Houston was barely out of her teens, but already whispers followed her wherever she sang. Who is that girl? Where did she come from? Her tone was impossibly smooth, her range commanding, her presence magnetic. Industry professionals took note, but it would be one night, one performance that changed everything. Clive Davis, the legendary record executive and head of Arista Records, sat in the smoky room of a small club nursing a drink when Whitney took the stage. She wasn't famous yet. She didn't need to be. Within moments, Clive's pen was out, notes scribbled frantically. He knew he had found something transcendent. It wasn't just talent, it was timeless. And Clive, a master of spotting greatness, knew exactly what to do. In 1983, at just 19 years old, Whitney Houston signed with Arista Records. But her debut wouldn't be rushed. Clive Davis was methodical. He wanted every track to shine, every lyric to resonate. Over the next 2 years, Whitney worked with the best producers, songwriters, and arrangers in the business. Together, they built something not just musical, but historic. On February 14th, 1985, her debut album, simply titled Whitney Houston, was released. At first, the reaction was warm, but slow. The initial single, Someone for Me, made modest ripples. But then came You Give Good Love. Then, Saving All My Love for You. And suddenly, Whitney was no longer just a promising voice. She was a sensation. Her vocal control, the emotion, the grace with which she climbed each note and landed like a feather on the final breath. It was something the world hadn't seen since Aretha. The album became a phenomenon. By 1986, her debut would sell over 13 million copies in the US alone. She was awarded her first Grammy for Saving All My Love for You, and her performance at the ceremony was nothing short of electrifying. Elegant white gown, poised posture, voice gliding effortlessly into the heavens. But beneath the applause, there was still vulnerability. Whitney was young, thrust into a world of handlers, press tours, long studio nights, flashing cameras. There was little time to breathe, let alone process the weight of being labeled the next big thing. She was polished, yes, trained to perfection by her mother and refined by Clive, but the expectations were immense and heavy. She would later admit the pressure to be perfect never let up. Still, Whitney smiled, she sang. She delivered, hit after hit, show after show. The world had never heard a voice like hers, but they were only just beginning to understand its power. This was no longer the girl from New Hope Baptist Church. This was Whitney Houston, America's sweetheart, Arista's crown jewel, and the woman whose voice was about to take over the world. Rise to fame. By the time the late 1980s arrived, Whitney Houston wasn't just rising, she was ascending. Her debut had already made her a star, but it was her second album, Whitney, released in 1987, that launched her into the stratosphere. The lead single, I Want to Dance with Somebody Who Loves Me, wasn't just a song, it was an anthem. Bright, joyful, irresistible, and carried by a vocal that made every lyric feel like it was sung just for you. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, making her the first woman in history to do so. It sold over 10 million copies in the US alone and gave the world hit after hit. So emotional, Didn't We Almost Have It All? And Where Do Broken Hearts Go? Each single a powerhouse, each performance iconic. She wasn't just dominating the charts, she was redefining them. At one point, Whitney had 7 consecutive #1 singles, breaking a record previously held by the Beatles and the Bee Gees. But this wasn't about records anymore. This was about legacy, one that was being written in real time. And yet, with fame came a sharp edge. Despite her enormous success, criticism began to surface. Some in the Black community accused Whitney of crossing over too far, of catering too much to white pop audiences. During the 1989 Soul Train Awards, she was booed. A moment that cut deeper than any chart position could heal. It was the first time Whitney began to feel the sting of public rejection, not from the critics or tabloids, but from the very people whose approval she craved most. In response, Whitney said little. She sang louder. She poured her identity into every performance, an elegant defiance in sequins and stilettos. Her voice had no race, no barrier. It soared above it all. As the decade came to a close, Whitney was at the height of global superstardom. Endorsement deals, sold-out world tours, platinum plaques stacked like bricks. She was on magazine covers, morning shows, late-night stages. Every little girl wanted to sing like Whitney. Every artist wanted to be Whitney. But as the lights burned brighter, shadows began to grow behind them. Fame had its price. The pressure to be flawless, vocally, visually, behaviorally, was immense. There was little room to stumble, little space to just be. The isolation of her fame slowly set in, even as her smile remained fixed and her vocals unwavering. She was admired, but she was also alone. Still, through it all, her artistry endured. Whitney Houston had become more than a singer. She was a cultural force, a once-in-a-lifetime voice who had risen above boundaries and broken every ceiling placed above her. And yet, this wasn't even her peak. The 1990s were waiting. With a film role, a ballad that would echo through eternity, and a level of fame even she couldn't imagine. The true heights and heartbreaks were still to come. Career highlights and achievements. If the 1980s made Whitney Houston a star, the 1990s turned her into an icon. In 1992, Whitney took a daring leap from the stage to the silver screen, and the result was a cultural earthquake. The Bodyguard, her film debut, was more than just a box office hit. Paired alongside Kevin Costner, Whitney played Rachel Marin, a world-famous singer under threat, protected by a stoic bodyguard. But behind the suspense, it was a film about vulnerability, fame, and the price of love. A story that mirrored Whitney's own life in haunting ways. The critics were mixed, but the audience, they were captivated. And then came the voice. I Will Always Love You wasn't just a cover of Dolly Parton's 1974 classic. It was a reinvention. Whitney took that song and with a whisper, a breath, and a climactic crescendo, she owned it. The power, the restraint, the emotion. It became her signature, a global love letter that would echo for generations. The soundtrack to The Bodyguard sold over 45 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling movie soundtrack of all time. I Will Always Love You spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, a record-breaking reign. Whitney swept the award circuit, Grammy for Record of the Year, American Music Awards, Billboard honors. That year, she wasn't just the biggest voice in music, she was the biggest name on earth. But she didn't stop there. In 1995, Whitney starred in Waiting to Exhale, a groundbreaking film centered on the lives of 4 Black women navigating love, loss, and identity. The movie was a landmark moment for representation in Hollywood, and Whitney, both as actress and executive producer of the soundtrack, was at its heart. The soundtrack, featuring songs by Aretha Franklin, Mary J. Blige, and Toni Braxton, was another commercial triumph. A year later, she returned to her gospel roots in The Preacher's Wife, acting alongside Denzel Washington. That soundtrack became the best-selling gospel album of all time, cementing her versatility and spiritual core. Through it all, her voice remained the anchor. It was thunderous yet tender, grand yet intimate. Every note she sang seemed dipped in something sacred, a gift that defied time. By the late 1990s, Whitney Houston had achieved what few artists ever could. Over 200 million records sold, more than 400 awards, including 6 Grammys, 22 American Music Awards, and an Emmy. She was named the most awarded female artist of all time by the Guinness World Records. But for all the brilliance of her career, fame came at a cost. Behind the scenes, the whispers were growing louder. Stories of missed rehearsals, canceled interviews, strained vocals. The media, once dazzled by her perfection, began circling like vultures, sniffing out scandal. Whitney smiled for the cameras, but something was shifting beneath the surface. Still, even when the spotlight turned harsh, her voice never truly left her. Her legacy was already engraved in the halls of music history. Her songs now lullabies, anthems, wedding ballads, and farewell hymns. She was more than a singer, more than an actress, more than a star. She was Whitney Houston. And at her peak, she was the moment. Relationships and marriage. In the late 1980s, Whitney Houston stood as the embodiment of grace, vocal perfection, and polished stardom. Bobby Brown, on the other hand, was chaos wrapped in leather, the bad boy of R&B, known for his unpredictable energy and wild stage antics. They came from 2 different worlds, but when their eyes met backstage at the Soul Train Awards, a spark ignited, electric, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Whitney had dated high-profile names before, but Bobby was different. He was raw, unfiltered, defiant. The chemistry between them was undeniable, a firestorm of opposites attracting. Friends and family raised eyebrows, critics scoffed. But Whitney was in love, and love, for better or worse, was something she pursued with her whole heart. On July 18, 1992, Whitney and Bobby married at her New Jersey estate. The wedding was extravagant, drenched in white silk, diamonds, and doves, but behind the glamour, whispers of concern echoed through the crowd. Many feared this union, despite its passion, would pull Whitney away from the light she had fought so hard to shine. Their early years were filled with laughter, lavish vacations, and the birth of their daughter, Bobbi Kristina. But beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form. Bobby, still clinging to his bad boy image, struggled with Whitney's colossal fame. The tabloids dubbed him Mr. Houston, often portraying him as a shadow in her spotlight. Meanwhile, Whitney, so often cast as America's golden girl, began to rebel against the squeaky clean image the world demanded of her. Together, they were combustible, passionate lovers one moment, volatile combatants the next. Substance abuse soon entered the picture, first whispered about, then screamed from headlines. There were arrests, rehab stays, canceled tours, and chaotic interviews. Their relationship became tabloid fodder, reality TV before reality TV. Being Bobby Brown, a show documenting their day-to-day life, pulled back the curtain too far. Fans who once idolized Whitney now saw her unguarded, erratic, vulnerable. Yet for all the toxicity, there was also loyalty. Whitney defended Bobby at every turn. She called him her heartbeat. When the world judged him, she wrapped him in defiance. And when she was at her lowest, he was often still there. Flawed, yes, but present. Their love was not fairy tale. It was not clean or quiet. It was loud, painful, complicated. And in many ways, it mirrored the larger struggle in Whitney's life, a tug of war between image and identity, between what the world demanded of her and what she truly needed. In 2006, after nearly 14 years of marriage, Whitney filed for divorce. It was a difficult, public unraveling, marked by custody battles and media spectacle, but it also marked the beginning of a slow, painful rebirth. When asked about Bobby later in life, Whitney never spoke with hate, only sadness, regret, love, perhaps still lingering in the shadows. Their marriage was many things, tumultuous, intoxicating, destructive, but above all, it was real. And in that rawness, Whitney's humanity was laid bare for all to see, because even legends fall in love, even icons break. Family life and parenting. In the whirlwind of fame, awards, and endless flashing cameras, there was one moment that slowed everything down for Whitney Houston. One moment that changed the way she saw the world. March 4th, 1993, the day her daughter, Bobbi Kristina Brown, was born. For Whitney, motherhood wasn't just another chapter, it was a rebirth. All the noise of the world faded when she held her daughter. The pressure, the headlines, the scrutiny, none of it mattered in those quiet moments of rocking Bobby to sleep or whispering lullabies into her tiny ears. Whitney often described her daughter as the love of my life, and it was true. She adored her with a depth that came from her own upbringing, rooted in family, faith, and fierce maternal love. Bobbi Kristina traveled everywhere with her, on tour buses, private planes, red carpets, and recording sessions. If Whitney was there, Bobby was close by. She wanted to shield her from the very industry that had taken so much from her, but it wasn't easy. The marriage between Whitney and Bobby Brown, though passionate, was a storm that never quite calmed. The arguments, the rumors, the substance abuse, it all unfolded in front of Bobbi Kristina, often on public stages. Even when Whitney tried to protect her, the chaos would leak through the cracks. There were good days, too. Days filled with singing around the house, baking cookies, watching Disney movies on repeat. Whitney would sit at the piano and play, while Bobbi Kristina curled up next to her, humming along, as if the music was already stitched into her DNA. But as Bobby grew older, she began to see the shadows, the realities of addiction, the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. And Whitney, for all her strength and love, was struggling to hold everything together. In interviews, Whitney often spoke of the pressure to be a perfect mother, a perfect wife, a perfect icon, but she was human. She stumbled. She cried behind closed doors. She doubted herself. And yet, she always came back to Bobby. After her divorce in 2006, Whitney retreated from the public eye for a time. She focused on healing, on her daughter, on rebuilding the pieces of her life that fame had fractured. She entered rehab. She tried to find peace in prayer, in family, in music once again. Their bond remained deep, a relationship filled with unconditional love, but also the complications of two lives shaped by the same fame machine. Bobbi Kristina idolized her mother, and in so many ways, she wanted to be her. She sang like her, moved like her, hurt like her, and tragically, she would mirror more than just her talent. But in those years together, despite everything, Whitney Houston gave her daughter the most honest gift she had left: love. Flawed, yes, but unbreakable. Whitney's greatest role wasn't singer or star or legend. It was simply mom. Tragic death and impact. On the afternoon of February 11th, 2012, the music world came to a standstill. Inside her fourth-floor suite at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, just hours before she was set to perform at Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammy Gala, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in a bathtub. Despite immediate emergency response, it was too late. The voice that had once soared over stadiums and radios around the world had gone silent forever. She was only 48 years old. The news hit with the force of a thunderclap. At first, confusion, then disbelief, and finally, an aching, universal grief. The hotel, still bustling with celebrities and Grammy weekend guests, was suddenly steeped in hushed disbelief. Fans began gathering outside. Reporters flocked to the scene. Tributes started pouring in, not just from fellow artists, but from everyday people, the ones whose lives had been touched by her music in ways too deep to measure. The coroner's report, released days later, delivered a cold but sobering truth. Accidental drowning with cocaine, heart disease, and prescription drugs listed as contributing factors. For years, whispers of Whitney's struggles with addiction had haunted the headlines. Now the damage was irreversible. Her body, worn from the long war between light and shadow, had simply surrendered. But Whitney's story, her true story, could never be summarized in a toxicology report. Because she was never just her downfall, she was a revolution, a radiant force who had redefined what it meant to be a woman, a black artist, a global star. Her voice had once been described as a national treasure, powerful yet vulnerable, heavenly yet human. It was the voice of hope, of love, of heartbreak, and resilience. And though her final years were marked by hardship, her legacy was already etched in the stars. Whitney's funeral, held in her hometown of Newark, New Jersey, was not just a memorial. It was a homecoming, a full circle goodbye. Her casket was adorned in gold, her memory carried through tearful tributes and voices raised in harmony. Aretha Franklin, Alicia Keys, Stevie Wonder, and Clive Davis all honored her through word and song. Her bodyguard co-star, Kevin Costner, stood at the pulpit and fought back tears as he recalled their time together. She had this gift, he said. She had a voice that came from God. The grief was national, but for one young woman, it was deeply personal. 3 years later, in January 2015, tragedy struck again. Bobbi Kristina Brown, Whitney's only child, her pride, her purpose, her mirror, was found unconscious in a bathtub in her Georgia home. The similarities were chilling. She was placed in a medically induced coma, her condition never improving. After nearly 6 months on life support, she passed away at the tender age of 22. It was a second funeral, a second goodbye. And for those who had loved Whitney, it was a sorrow almost too much to bear. But even in death, Whitney Houston's legacy endures. Over 200 million records sold, multiple Grammy Awards, chart-topping hits that have become the soundtrack to love stories, heartbreaks, celebrations, and quiet moments alone. But more than numbers, it's the feeling she left behind. The uplift, the ache, the reminder that even flawed, we are worthy of song. She was a gift, brilliant, broken, and breathtakingly human. And though her voice has faded from the stage, it echoes still. The abandoned house. Once, this place pulsed with music. A private estate tucked into the hills of Mendham Township, New Jersey. 5 acres of wooded quiet, where Whitney Houston once sought refuge from a world that loved her voice, but never quite understood her heart. Here she could breathe. Behind the gated entrance and winding driveway stood a 6-bedroom mansion, customized to her every dream. With cathedral-high ceilings, polished marble floors, and a state-of-the-art recording studio built into its foundation, it was more than a home. It was her sanctuary. This was the place where music was born in the early morning hours, where Bobbi Kristina danced in pajamas, and where the outside world, with all its scrutiny, couldn't reach. The home had everything: an Olympic-sized swimming pool, a media room, a gym, an indoor basketball court, and a sound system that filled every corner with the songs she lived to sing. It was a fortress of beauty, a palace of dreams, a space where family, creativity, and solitude collided. And yet, it could not keep out the storm. As the years passed and Whitney's personal battles deepened, addiction, fame fatigue, public criticism, and heartbreak, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a vault, a place not of celebration, but of retreat. Friends noted that the once vibrant energy of the estate grew quiet. Rooms that echoed with song slowly fell silent. Curtains stayed drawn longer. Doors closed tighter. After Whitney's tragic passing in 2012, the estate entered a kind of suspended animation. It sat untouched, full of furniture, memories, and the heavy hush of absence. Real estate agents tried to sell it. Some were deterred by the weight of its history, others by its sheer size. The public, once captivated by the house's beauty, now saw it as haunted, not by ghosts, but by grief. It was listed, relisted, and eventually sat vacant for years, a shell of splendor, rotting slowly under seasonal rain and winter frost. Even in its decay, the home told her story. The walls, once vibrant with Whitney's laughter, now seemed to mourn. The mirrors, once reflecting her as the star the world adored, stared back with emptiness. Rooms designed for comfort now echoed with loneliness. Because this wasn't just architecture, it was a monument. to a life lived in the spotlight, and a woman who often just wanted to hide from it. A woman who gave so much of herself, she needed a fortress to feel whole again. A woman whose final years, though clouded, still held glimmers of music, motherhood, and moments of grace. In 2014, the mansion finally sold. Not to a fan, not to a foundation, but to a developer. The price? Just $1.5 million, nearly half of what Whitney paid in 1987 at the height of her fame. The plan was not to restore, but to demolish, to build anew. And so, the house that once held the voice of a generation was erased. But, for those who remember, the ghost of it lingers still. The driveway that once welcomed limousines. The studio where unreleased tracks still might live on a forgotten tape. The front door, where Whitney once stood, waving to cameras with that million-watt smile. Now all that remains is a question, whispered through time, through crumbling plaster and fading photographs. How can something so full of life be so easily forgotten? She was born into music and became its miracle. Whitney Houston didn't just have a voice. She was the voice, a voice that broke through boundaries, healed hearts, and carried the weight of joy, sorrow, and soul in every note. She soared across stages, crossed oceans with her songs, and became a symbol of excellence, especially for young Black girls who saw in her what they were told they couldn't be. But behind the perfection, there was pain. Behind the gold records, a woman trying to hold herself together. Fame is rarely gentle, and for Whitney, it was both a crown and a cross. She gave everything to the world, her gift, her strength, even her fragility. And though her life ended far too soon, her story never truly did. Her music still plays at weddings, funerals, karaoke nights, and quiet drives home. Her voice comforts, it uplifts, it remembers. Her legacy is more than just songs or statistics. It's the little girl watching The Bodyguard for the first time and believing she can be powerful and beautiful. It's the struggling artist replaying Greatest Love of All when they need strength. It's the memory of a woman who stumbled, but never stopped loving. Her daughter, her family, her God, her music. The house is gone. The lights are dim, but Whitney is not forgotten. In the end, she gave the world something eternal, a voice that time cannot silence, a story that still moves us. And maybe, just maybe, that is the greatest love of all.